Hi, Sachsenhausen. Kolonia Gwarna, Parna, Germania richtig dicker Heil. Sachsenhausen. Wiertycie jak bambusik, trupie łebki to kaktusy heil. Es lebe kule to Kampf.
Welcome to Descendant Stuff, a podcast by and for the descendants of Sachsenhausen prisoners, working together to uncover the unanswered questions of its history. Sachsenhausen was a Nazi concentration camp located in Oranienburg, Germany, used from 1936 through April 1945. It was used as a labor camp, with a network of subcamps and work sites around the region, as well as a prison camp, death camp, medical experimentation center, and SS training ground. It was also the administrative center for all Nazi concentration camps. We are Jakob, Kelsey, and Nicole, three descendants of Sachsenhausen prisoners. Though our relatives were imprisoned for different reasons, we've discovered we have much in common. In each episode, we interview other descendants, researchers, and even survivors, sharing stories, memories, and research to build a clearer picture of the past, one that goes beyond the records. Through these conversations, we honor those who suffered and died at Sachsenhausen and strengthen our collective understanding of our own ancestors' experiences. This interview is about Clemens Paul Feige. He was born in 1893 in Altreichenau, Waldenburg district in Silesia, Germany. On June 20th, 1938, at the age of 45, Clemens was deported as part of the Aktion Arbeitsscheu Reich, or Operation Work-Shy Reich. He was brought to Sachsenhausen, where he became prisoner number 3162, and where he died in December 1939. Visitors to Sachsenhausen can visit a memorial stone dedicated to Clemens by his family. It is the first memorial ever dedicated to a prisoner from within the so-called Asocial prisoner group, and can be found in the Memorial Garden at Sachsenhausen. In this interview, Jakob and Kelsey speak with Clemens' great-grandson, Hilger Voss.
Hilger, who was your relative that was in Sachsenhausen?
Yeah, my relative was Clemens Paul Feige, my great-grandfather. He was my mother's father.
What do you know about his life before Sachsenhausen?
Actually, I know very little. I know when he was born. Of course, then I know when he got married, when my grandmother was born, when her brother was born, and some more details. And then, of course, when he came to Sachsenhausen in 1938. And then the last thing is when he died there at the end of 1939.
Do you know about what he did in life? Did he have a job, or do you know things about the family before he arrived?
He was born in 1893 in Silesia. He was the fifth of 6 children, and his father was a baker who ran a bakery and later also a butcher shop. In 1911, his father died, and soon after, the bakery and butcher shop went broke. My great-grandfather was in the First World War. Towards the end, he was taken prisoner by the Russians, but he was released shortly after the war. Before, he had also studied to be a butcher or learned the butcher's trade. But after the war, he couldn't find work. He moved away, but stayed still in Silesia and found a job as a foreman in a mine.
Where did you live in Silesia?
He was born in Altreichenau, and later the family moved to Milic. In Upper Silesia, I don't have the place right now. My grandfather wrote just a little bit about him in his memoir, and he mentioned that my great-grandfather was involved in the labor movement at the time. In 1920, he got married. His wife worked as a cook, and my grandmother was born in the same year. 3 years later, 1923, my grandmother's brother was born, and in 1927, when the third child should be born, my great-grandmother died, and the child died soon after. So my grandmother and her brother were taken in by relatives. Especially my grandmother lived with her aunt, like her father's sister. But things didn't go so well there, so she switched to another aunt and stayed with her and was also adopted. Obviously, there would still have been contact between my grandmother's family and her father, but we know nothing about this. It's just that we lose trace of everything about him in 1927, but then nobody ever talked about it. So it's really, people knew then, but we don't know now what happened. So actually, between the time in the about late 30s and 1938, at least we don't know anything what he did and where he was, and nobody is still alive who could answer any questions. One great aunt once mentioned that he worked as a peddler at the time, but this is really everything we know. Maybe some more details, but this is actually everything our family knows about him and everything that happened up until 1938. And then, of course, when he was arrested and interned in Sachsenhausen, this was on June 20th in 1938, because this is documented. And the next thing we know is that he died in December 19th, 1939, and was cremated a few days later in the Baumschulenweg crematorium in Berlin, because the crematorium in Sachsenhausen hadn't existed at the time. Cause of death was written as embolism, but we know this is quite common to find, so it's not really that we really believe this is how he died in the end. The last things that are also documented, his prisoner number was 3162, and the number of his in the mass grave is 5/439. These are all the hard facts, or more or less, that we could find out or that were known in the family.
Do you know why he was imprisoned in Sachsenhausen?
He was, as the date already indicates, June 20th, 1938, he was arrested as a so-called antisocial, but we really got no idea what really happened to him, if he was out of work or whatever. I mean, these signs, as my grandfather wrote, that he was involved in politics or the labor movement, but then obviously he wasn't imprisoned as a political prisoner, but really just as a so-called antisocial. But really, we got no idea. We can just imagine what might have been, because obviously in the family it was known that this was the reason why he was arrested. And it seems like everyone was so ashamed of him that nobody would really talk about him, and he really didn't exist anymore. So we don't have any letters or whatever, because the family had to move in the war from Silesia and could take nothing with them. We can just assume from informations or experiences of others who were in Sachsenhausen. Of course, it was possible to write letters and people also could get help, but we know nothing about this.
So from what you were saying in telling the story about him, the family wasn't in very much contact before he entered Sachsenhausen. Is that correct?
Yes, we don't know exactly for how long. So I cannot really say since 1927, nobody knew anything anymore, or maybe 1930. But more or less it's the same. There are several years, at least we don't know about, because nobody talked about. If they really didn't know where he was in these more or less 10 years, that we cannot tell. It's just we assume someone would have known. But at least after his death and after the war and everything, even when my mother was a small child, nobody would really talk about him. So he didn't exist anymore, and he had never existed, so to say.
Wow. Why do you think the family didn't talk about him?
I mean, being called antisocial is quite a stigma even to this day. It's still an insult that people use. And people who are called antisocial, I don't want to say they have the same problems now as they had like 80 years ago. It is not everything had changed so much, and especially in a conservative environment, 1950s Germany, 1960s, when everybody was really wanted to forget about the past and everybody started being really well off. It seemed as shameful as it did in the time of the Nazis. And then, of course, there are other things that we don't know. I can be quite safe to assume that it was really very traumatic for my grandmother, not only losing her mother, at the age of 7, but then somehow losing the father because he couldn't cope with the children. First living with one aunt where things didn't work out so well, and then with the other.
Yeah, it seems like there was a series of hardships for the family that started when your great-grandfather was a child, when he was young and his father's employment didn't work. The bakery failed, and then going to war, being a prisoner of war and coming out of that already was a hardship. So I can imagine that this has, with his wife dying and those children, all of that is already a large challenge for the family.
Yes, I don't know so much about the story of my grandmother's brother, but his story was really very similar to his father. Obviously, with my great-grandfather at a rather young age, being in the First World War, maybe then suffering from PTSD, then economic crisis, and then, of course, his wife dying. And then really there are a lot of things we don't know about him and we can't know about him, like maybe neurodiversity or however you would want to call it. Even this label, antisocial, is obviously one thing doesn't preclude the other. So it's really a big mystery, especially as nobody would ever talk about this. What I meant to say about my grandmother's brother, it seems to some extent hereditary because he really had quite a similar history, that he also left his family at a quite young age and died alone somewhere, obviously not in a concentration camp, but still my grandmother never wanted any contact with her brother and his family. So it's really just came down to my mother, who contacted them much later when my grandmother had already died. It feels a bit late to really build a strong relationship.
When Clemens was arrested in June 1938 as part of this so-called Asocial act, he was isolated from the family, and I'm imagining that when he arrived, he didn't have the family support that maybe other prisoners had to get money or even moral support from family.
Yes, we cannot know absolutely for sure. But then again, we can be quite sure that the family must have known, because prisoners were allowed to write letters. Prisoners would also receive letters or packages. Just thinking from what we know, obviously he didn't get any help, and everybody really never talked about him afterwards. We can just assume that he was already excluded from the family at this point.
Do you know when he arrived at Sachsenhausen? Do you know what barrack he was in?
No, we couldn't find out. As I said before, we know his prisoner number, we know the dates, we know when he died. There is no more. Maybe there could be some new information around right now, but then again, it wouldn't really change so much about the general story, so to say.
So you don't know anything about his time in the camp?
No, it's really like we know when he got there and we know when he died and that he died there. And the rest is really just a black box. We can just assume how it was at the time. I mean, your great-grandfather was there at the same time, more or less.
2 days earlier.
They might have stayed in the same barracks, but then again, 6,000 men were arrested in these days. So who knows? We can assume from experiences of others that it would have been quite the same.
Can you tell us about the experience of the others that you've learned? Because I think it's a very specific prisoner group who arrived at the camp, and it's a very specific experience because it was the first wave of arrests that brought a large number of prisoners to the camp all at once. So it was a big change that happened. And I'm just wondering, have you read about that? Have you heard from maybe other prisoners' descriptions of that time to try and figure out a little bit more about Clemens's life at the camp?
Yes, of course. There's not so much in writing, especially on this prisoner group, because they were recognized only in 2020. And as I already tried to say before, nobody wants to have an ancestor who was called antisocial, and maybe a lot of so-called antisocials wouldn't really write down so much or write books because nobody was really interested in this group. It was still considered a shame because everybody could have said, yeah, maybe they deserved it. I mean, there's this other group, the so-called career criminals, that were more or less about the same, even if usually they weren't criminals in that way, because real criminals were in prison or maybe in the SS. It's not the same, but it's still, if you can say my grandfather or great-grandfather was in the resistance, this is a nice story, so to say. But if you say, no, he was antisocial, then a lot of people might have asked, yeah, maybe he deserved it or something. So that was actually the official way of looking at it until a few years ago.
Some families, it's almost a point of pride that their relative would be in the resistance, and so the family might have talked about it more, and then you would know more. It was hard to even understand the documentation of how people became labeled antisocial in order to get to Sachsenhausen. The reasoning why people got that label was not clear until decades afterwards.
It's still going on because people say that more about the so-called criminals, but even antisocial, most of the criminals were always used as capos and in the camps in a way like really everybody was looking down on them because they were really worse than everybody else. Even if it was so, it was mostly because these groups among themselves, they didn't feel any kind of solidarity. So maybe everybody felt like, okay, they arrested me as a criminal, but I am not, but the others may be. Or they arrested me as an antisocial, but really I just got here by coincidence, and the others may really be antisocials. It was always much easier to take people from these groups because they didn't belong to big, strong groups as most of all communists or socialists. And yeah, with Jews, I don't know so much. That makes it easier for people even today to say communists were the good guys and the others, they would still say they had somehow deserved it. I mean, even in the old GDR, the former prisoners who were communists were considered heroes and the others were forgotten or even still in trouble. So
I've been slowly reading the book written by Harry Noyux, who's the former highest ranking prisoner in the camp, who had arrived in 1936 and stayed in the camp through the whole war. So it's really helpful to hear his records because he has so much information over such a long period of time. And then he also wrote the book with a lot of help from other former prisoners who could help describe the details. And when I read what he says about this time when the so-called asocial prisoners arrived at the camp, he describes the moment of arrival as almost being a specific kind of torture where everybody had to stand at the roll call area and get a speech. And apparently everybody got the same speech over and over again as these new groups came in. And there were so many of these prisoners, around 6,000 prisoners all of a sudden, it doubled the size of the camp. And it meant that there was just chaos with the clothes that people got. Like they got wooden shoes with no socks and they were 2 left feet. And it was such chaos that prisoners didn't have a job. If you didn't have a job or a role, you would get punished for not working or being lazy. And so people would just walk around with a tool in their hand and look busy in order to not get beaten. And there were not beds enough for everyone, so they just had mats on the floor and it doubled the amount of prisoners who were even inside of a barrack at the same time. It just sounded like total chaos. And then that in every speech when they came, when these prisoners arrived at the camp, there would be a few select prisoners who would be taken to be beaten just to show an example, and they would be flogged over this special tool for beating prisoners and until they were unconscious, and then they had to be woken up again to be continued with their beatings. I think it's helpful to have this illustration of this was a special new wave that came into Sachsenhausen.
The Nazis nearly managed to erase the person completely. They managed to kill him, and they nearly managed that nobody would remember the person anymore. And as you said, your grandparents, they did not really talk about him. And since he died in the camp and could not talk about it, there are no letters left. You don't even know what really happened within the camp. But it changed. In case somebody had a guided tour in Sachsenhausen within the last years, they might even have heard the name because there is small memorial. And I think it has something to do with your mother. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about the memorial.
Yes. I mean, I try to start more or less at the beginning, as my mother told me how she first got to know about her grandfather. When she was in elementary school, children once had as a homework they should draw a family tree. So it was her with her sisters. There were her parents and her father's parents and her mother's parents, and she wrote the names of her mother's parents. Then my grandmother came, crossed these names out and said, no, they are called Clemens and Emma. And the first time she heard these names, her great aunt, who was living with them all the time, she had adopted my grandmother. So she was always called a grandmother. And my mother didn't know that she wasn't actually her grandmother, but actually grand aunt. Her husband had already died, but then he was the one my mother had considered as her grandfather. So that was the first time she ever heard about her grandfather. That was all. My grandmother obviously wanted everything to be correct, but wouldn't talk about it. My mother said every time she wanted to ask her more, she just wouldn't get answers, and that was it. So she said she always had the feeling there was something wrong. Just me thinking now, thinking of my grandmother's story, in 1938 in June, it was 2 months before her 18th birthday. Maybe her aunt never told her anything. In a way, thinking about this hidden history of family, or really dark history, especially of my grandmother, I can't really imagine. My grandmother died in 2011. To me, it seems like my mother felt free afterwards to start some research. And we had known a bit before. In a way, it wasn't really the great shock. It's not like one day you know nothing and the next day you know that your great-grandfather was murdered in a concentration camp and was considered antisocial. But really, nobody seems to quite remember. Some knowledge has been around since, not when I was a kid, but when I was already grown up in the 1990s. So my mother thought for some time that he was in a different camp. And then I remember once my uncle visiting Berlin, and he said he was in Sachsenhausen, but then it was quite common knowledge that my great-grandfather was in Sachsenhausen and that he died there. But we didn't know much about the circumstances or why he was there. We gained this knowledge step by step. To get back to the beginning, in a way, when my grandmother wasn't still there, my mother started researching, and she also was in Sachsenhausen and Baumschulenweg, and she, to some extent, found out everything that I told about before. But then again, she also found out that there isn't anything to find out in a way, which is still quite strange. But then she thought about doing something, because this memorial garden in Sachsenhausen had already existed then. There were some monuments already there. Some for individuals and some for groups like Russian prisoners, I remember, and others. And she developed this idea. What came down is a monument constructed of sandstone and little rocks in synthetic resin. And the special thing about these little rocks is that she contacted everyone in the family, every descendant of her grandfather, and all descendants of her grand aunts, and everyone she could find, more than 100 people, and asked them to collect rocks from wherever they are, small rocks like 4 or 5 centimeters in diameter. And then she put these in resin, and these are part of the monument now, because you can see them even if it's not explained what this is about. The nice thing about this is that everyone she contacted, or everyone she could reach, they participated. Everybody would send her some rocks, and nobody would say, no, I don't want to, or no, antisocial, I don't want to have anything to do with this. So this was a really satisfying experience, just to see that everybody would go along with this.
That is so exciting.
And the special thing about this memorial is that it was erected before there was actually a commemoration sign for the prisoner category of the so-called antisocials.
Yes, it was erected in 2017. So my parents would come to Berlin and the rest of our family, and not everybody who participated, but we were maybe like 20 persons there. And my mother had organized a little ceremony also with music. It was really nice. Yeah, especially as you say, the first commemoration sign for the so-called antisocial prisoners was inaugurated in 2023, 20-30 meters away from my great-grandfather's monument. And the year after, last year, there was another commemoration sign that looks the same as the one for the antisocials, for the career criminals. But it was really like 7 years ahead, and especially my mother was in close contact with the then director of the memorial site, who was really, it seems strange to say that he was happy about this. This was quite a big thing, because he by himself, he was also researching on the descendants of antisocials, and he told us stories like when he visited people, and when he said what he wanted, they would close him the door into his face. So it was really like a lot of people still wouldn't want to have to do with this. Considering that only in 2020 the group was really accepted as victims, so when absolutely the last one would have died, so nobody would have to pay anything. It was really a great idea my mother had at the time. Every time I come there, I look if everything is all right. Sometimes I take pictures because the resin doesn't hold up as well as it was planned to be. Still, it's great that it's there. People put little stones on top of this. It's not just there in the garden where there are like 20, 30 memorials, but it's really that some of the guides told me that they would really incorporate this memorial into their tours and tell a bit of the story. Because this memorial itself doesn't say so much. It's just there's just one sentence, and there's a name, and then there is the name of the families, and then of course when he was born and when he died in Sachsenhausen, when he came there. But there's no background of my great-grandfather, so just knowing that the guides would really tell about his story on their tours. So it was also satisfying in some way, because so far, at least I and maybe my mother, we had only looked on this monument as a thing for ourselves, for our family. At least I never expected that it would really be something that it could be their entrance into this story, or getting them interested in this prisoner group that would otherwise be forgotten. In some way, really, this is actually where my story would start, because all we have had so far about my great-grandfather was a little picture of his in a medallion, just as little as a small finger's nails, nothing more. And then my grandfather in the 1950s took a photo of this. Later, my mother scanned it. This is all what we have left of our great-grandfather, or in my mother's case, her grandfather.
It's the only photo. The only photo you have.
Yeah, and you can hardly recognize anything, and we don't know when was it taken. I think in the 1920s, maybe when he got married. This is actually everything we have. And now we have much more than we ever had before. When this monument was inaugurated, there was also some press release and text, at least on the side of the Sachsenhausen Memorial. And especially when the general memorial sign for the so-called antisocials was inaugurated in 2024. He was given as an example of the group of antisocials because they didn't have any other names. The story was really spread in all big media, at least in Germany. And even one newspaper, they did even some deeper research, and everyone named his name. Yeah, these stories always work better if you can give it a face. Everybody used his name. So in a way, my great-grandfather suddenly, after he died for nearly 80 years, he was forgotten, and suddenly he got a name again, and sometimes this picture was even published. So he had a name and a face again, and he wasn't just someone who was nameless and completely forgotten.
What does it mean for you being a descendant of a prisoner? Like, why do you think that you're involved in talking with us today?
For me, it's a thing that even if I cannot really say when it started, as I said before, when I would really know that my great-grandfather was murdered in a concentration camp, it never changed my attitude in the first place. So in a way, when I was at school, I was obviously very much against Nazis or neo-Nazis at the time. So it's not that simply that before I knew about my great-grandfather, I didn't care, and suddenly I do. My family was involved, not simply as all Germans are, that everybody was involved on the other side, so to say. But you also see there's someone who was really not Jewish, not Jehovah's Witnesses, not a socialist, not communist, but he was just someone who had a bit of bad luck. Maybe he was a homeless alcoholic. I don't think so. But even if he had been a homeless alcoholic, he wouldn't have deserved to die in that way or even be locked up. Nazis needed a lot of laborers for their great Germania projects and everything. So they didn't ask too many questions when they arrested people. And this makes it even sadder because if this had happened 20 years earlier or later, it would still be a sad story. If you say my great-grandfather was hypothetically drunk and he lived on the street and he died there or something, this would be really traumatizing and really, really sad. But then again, suddenly you have this story, or maybe it isn't even this, but somehow my great-grandfather is personally involved really in the greatest crime in human history. He was murdered by the Nazis. He was in a concentration camp. Just this idea, it's really difficult to really get my head around. If you live in Germany and you grew up in Germany in the 1980s, teachers in school older than like mid-50s, then you know they were in the Hitlerjugend or Waffen-SS. I know for a fact of some of my old teachers, 60-year-olds in Germany in the 1980s, they were like 90% Nazis. And just imagining this, that you lived in this world and you couldn't even start questioning it because there was no way around this. Yeah, to some extent you have to arrange yourself with that. And now it's all much easier when really just there are some prison guards in court, but they are like 99 years old. There's not so much you can do now, but just imagining in the 1980s there were still millions of them around. You have to live with the fact that everybody is guilty here, so let's not talk too much about this. You didn't really question that at the time. Born 30 years after the war, my parents born after the war and not having been Nazis and everything, but somehow the whole society was always involved. And somehow you can see that you have this part of yourself who wasn't involved, but who was really one of the victims, because there was always this victims were Jews, victims were communists, and maybe some resistance fighters, and only a few hundred, or I don't know. So there were not many people to talk about. Jews, most Jews were dead. Really, really few were still living in Germany. A few tens of thousands, I think. The rest went to, Israel or the USA. It was really not something you would really think about so much because I grew up in a small town. There were no Jews, for example. So in a way, you were never confronted with really descendants of the victims. You know them from television, old people being interviewed or something, and these were other people. So it seemed so far away. Everybody was more or less involved. Most of all, it was embarrassing, and let's better forget about this.
Hilger, I'm so grateful for you telling this story and sharing your perspective.
So everybody who wants to know more about Clemens, next year, 2026, there will be exhibition in Sachsenhausen in Barrack 39, and Clemens will be part of it. So
check it out.
Yeah, thank you very much for listening.
Descendant Stuff podcast is produced by Jakob Feistauer, Kelsey Snook, and Nicole Wines, 3 descendants of Sachsenhausen prisoners and co-creators of the Sachsenhausen Stuff project. The Descendant Stuff team would like to extend a special thank you to the team at Sachsenhausen Memorial and Museum, especially Dr. Astrid Lai and the members of the Educational Department's project, What Voice Do We Have?, as well as the Descendants Collective Voices of the Next Generation. The theme song, Heil Sachsenhausen, was written by Alexander Kulisiewicz while he was imprisoned at Sachsenhausen and performed by him after the war. It is used with permission from the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum's Kulisiewicz collection. If you are a Sachsenhausen descendant who would like to share your story, please contact us through our website at www.sachsenhausen-stuff.com or use the Contact Us link in the show notes below.
Heil Sachsenhausen. A jak będę jutro wzdychał lewą nóżką, ci zawtikam Heil, es lebe wohl der Kampf.